All right.
Hi.
Oh, hey, perfect timing.
Sorry, I have
Yeah,
started now.
yeah. Just hop on into Scroller.
Mm, I'm here.
Okay, great. So let's get started. So this is our last market structure that we are discussing out of the four. Right? We started with perfect competition, then we looked at monopoly, then monopolistic competition, and this is the very last one, which is oligopoly. Okay. So we're going to talk about some characteristics of oligopoly, their behaviors. The great thing about oligopoly is that we don't have to draw any sort of diagram, any graph. There are no graphs, so I'm sure for some of you it's a relief. But we do have to look at something which is called the game theory, which we're gonna hope probably gonna have time to do in our next lecture. But for the rest of it, it's just mostly discussing characteristics and behaviors and a lot of talking. Okay, so bear with me. All right, so um, characteristics of oligopoly. So these are some of the few key characteristics that we're going to discuss. So the very first one is that in a oligopolistic market, the most important characteristic is that it is a type of industry or market that is dominated by a small number of large farms. So small number of large farms. So hopefully you can kind of see how this is different than perfect competition, monopoly, and monopolistic competition. So when we talked about perfect competition, we saw how there were many different, right? Many small farms, right? They're very small relative to the entire market. And it was the same thing with monopolistic competition, where there were, it was sort of the inverse, right? There were a large number of small farms, right? But with monopoly, of course, it was only one farm. And now with oligopoly, there is a small number of large farms. So um, and then each of these large farms, right? So each of these large farms, they are relatively large compared to the overall market, right? So they're no longer small compared to the entire market, but the few large farms, the few large farms are relatively big compared to the entire market.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives them, right? That gives these relatively large farms a substantial amount of market control. So although they don't have as much market control as a monopoly, but they definitely have more control about price and output than a monopolistically competitive farm. Okay, so the total number of farms that there are in an oligopolic industry, that's not the sort of key consideration here. So an oligopoly farm can actually have a large number of farms, right? But the distinguishing feature, so we saw that with monopolistically competitive industry, so they have a large number of farms, but the distinction here, the difference here between oligopoly and monopolistically competitive farms is that what about the top few farms, right? If the top few farms are big enough that they are producing and selling, right, almost half of the output in the entire market, then it would be an oligopoly. Okay, so it's top heavy in the sense that those few large those few large farms are gonna produce almost, more than half of the entire output in the market. Okay, is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And now let's talk about the type of product that the oligopoly tends to sell. So some oligopoly industry, they produce identical products, such in like we saw in Perfect Competition, and others will produce differentiated product. Okay, more like monopolistic competition. So if they're producing identical product, so this standardized means the same thing as identical. Okay, so the differentiated products, they tend to focus on items or goods that are sold for personal consumption, right? So these type of products would include automobiles, soft drinks, computers, smartphones. So the key here is that people have different, people enjoy variety, right? They need variety, and that's why people have different needs. So these goods are somewhat differentiated, but then there are also a lot of similarities, right? And if you take a look at these industries, like the automobiles industry, the computer industry, the software, I'm sorry, the smartphones, with all of these industries, they're relatively top heavy, which means that with automobiles in the USA, there are three manufacturers, which are Ford, Chrysler, and GMC. They are, they make up of, they're the top three. They're the largest producers, and they make up of a good share of the market. And if you look at computers and smartphones, right, the software for computers, it's right now, it's come down between two products, right? The Apple's iOS, well, it's for smartphone, right? Or the Google's Android phones, right? So it's almost entirely between these two software for smartphones. So it's almost like these two farms, entire control the entire market. Same thing with computers. It's either between, you're either gonna use an Apple product or a Windows, right? So there we see the same sort of analogy as well. And if the oligopoly are producing standardized product, identical products, that type of products they tend to sell tend to be raw materials. Okay, so these are crude oil, steel, aluminum. So we don't necessarily, so we don't use steel, right, for personal consumption. We don't use aluminum for personal consumption. They're mostly going to be used as input to make something else, right? So if the oligopolies are producing standardized products, they're mostly producing raw materials that are going to be used as input by other industries. Okay. Then the farm, there are entry barriers in an oligopoly market. It's difficult, but it's not entirely impossible to enter this market, right? So with perfect competition and monopolistic competition, we saw that it was very easy to go in and out of the market in the long run. But with monopoly, of course, there were huge barriers to entry or exit. It was virtually impossible. But with oligopoly, it's difficult but not impossible. And the type of the most prominent barriers to entry in oligopoly markets tends to be patents, ownership of resources, high startup costs, branding, all of these things work as barriers to entry. And if you are one of the top farms in an oligopoly industry, it is likely that you probably have one or few of these things working for you. You have patents on your products. You have you probably have you probably own the resources, or at least a good amount of the resources that are used to make your product. You have attained, you have branding, right? You have brand name for your product. You have loyal customers. So it is very difficult for a new farm to sort of enter this market and be able to overcome one or more of these kind of barriers, right? But it's not impossible. Then the last thing is mutual interdependence. Okay, so oligopoly farms, sorry, because there are a few large farms, right? They tend to have a great degree of market control, and which also means that there is a lot of interdependence among farms in the oligopoly industry. So by interdependence, we mean that the action of one farm will invariably affect the competitors, the other competitor farms, right? Whatever action you take is definitely going to affect your competitors in the industry. So that's why each oligopolistic farm sort of has to keep a close eye on the activities of other farms in the industry, because decisions that you make will impact your competitors, and the decisions that they make will impact you, right? So these decisions could be about raising price, lowering price, or um, if they're introducing a new product, if they're doing a lot of advertising, you're always going to have to sort of watch out for what your competitor is doing, and try to beat them, try to do better. Because you can sort of think of this competition among um, the oligopoly farms. It's comparable to a sort of like an athletic game, because in order for one team to win or to be successful, right, it's not just enough that you are doing well by yourself, right? You also have to hope, right, and pray that the other team sort of doesn't do well, right? If you both do equally, right, if you both do equally well, then the game comes to a draw. But in order for you to do well, the other team has to underperform, right? So that's why it's sort of similar analogy to how the oligopoly farms are sort of interdependent on each other. Okay, do you guys have any questions so far?
Yeah.
What question, Harry?
So what does it mean mutual?
Mutual meaning mutual interdependence, like that you're both doing something, right? Mutual just means like you're doing something at the same time.
Two persons.
Sorry? Yes, farms, two farms, yes. So you doing something affect the other, so there is this mutual sort of interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, can you just give me 1 second? Just 1 second, I will be right back.
No. Sandra, contesta tú, vamos a dormir.
No,
Estoy cabreado, estaba en ansiedad.
no he preguntado.
No entiendo nada. Tú lo aprendes con la otra.
¿Con qué tu recitation?
Darby.
A ver, el mío es uno que se llama Harry.
Ah,
Es el de Office Hours.
Chuchón.
Wow.
Este me va.
Okay. Hello, I'm back.
Right.
All right. So yeah, you can think of mutual as like sort of shared. Okay. So you doing something has an effect on me. Me doing something has an effect on you. So we're mutually dependent on each other. Like there is this shared dependence. Okay.
Mhm.
Then we are going to take a look at how this idea of concentration ratio. Okay, so because oligopoly has a small number of large farms, right, that produce a majority of the industry output, it means that the production of output and also the sales tends to be concentrated in the hands of those relatively few large farms. Okay, so we economists sort of use this concentration ratio to gauge how much market share is held by a certain number of farms. Okay, so um, concentration ratio, what it really measures, it gives you, it sort of indicates how competitive an industry really is. And this the you can think of it as a it's this ratio is just the fraction of the total industry activity. So it could be production, it could be sales. So how much of production or sales, how much of the um, activity in the entire industry or the market is accounted for by the largest 4 or 8 farms in the market. Okay, so it's essentially like how much of the market share is being held by the top 4 or the top 8 farms. So sometimes they use 4, sometimes they use 8. They might use other number too, but in any case, if they tell you something like a 4 farm concentration ratio of 85, okay, what it really means is that the top 4 farms in this industry combined, like together, they hold 85% of the market share. Okay, so together they are accounting for 85% of the activity that happens in the market. It could be they're producing 85% of the product in the market, or they're selling 85% of the products in the market. So as long as if they told you, it's the 8 farm concentration ratio of 85, that would just mean that the top 8 farms in the industry combined, they hold 85% of the market share. Okay, and that number, the concentration ratio, can range somewhere between 0 to 100%. The closer it is to 100, it means that, remember we said that it's sort of measuring the degree of competition in an industry. So the higher this number is, the concentration ratio, it means that the less competitive it is. So the higher the number, the less competitive it is, because if it's getting closer and closer to 100%, right? And so for 100%, if one farm the concentration ratio for, one farm concentration ratio of 100 would mean that, this industry is a monopoly because one farm, holds the entire market share, of 100%. But, just in general, the higher the number, the less competitive the industry. Okay. Do you guys have any question here?
No.
Sandra?
No.
What would a 5-farm concentration of 60 mean?
But it's not only the 4 largest.
So sometimes they use 4, sometimes they use 8. I think 4 is the most commonly used. But if, as long as you understand, it doesn't have to be 4 or 8. Sometimes it could be 3 or 5 as well. So right now I'm just saying, if it says, 5-farm concentration ratio of like 60, what does that mean?
So it will be 5 of 60.
So no, this is the ratio, right? So this is the number. So it basically would mean that the top 5 farms in the industry, they together, they hold 60% of the market share. Okay.
Okay.
So look at this. This is what it means. The top 5 farms, right? The concentration ratio is 60. That number is 60. So it just means that the top 5 farms in the industry combined, they hold 60% of the market share. Okay.
Okay.
Then we're going to talk a little bit about oligopoly behavior. Okay, so the oligopoly farm can choose to either make their own individual pricing decisions, and we call this non-collusion, when they make the decisions for pricing all by themselves. That is known as non-collusion. Or they can also meet with rivals in the industry, right? Their competitors, they can meet with their competitors to make industry pricing decisions, and we call that collusion. Okay, so let's take a look at what each of these things are. So first we start with collusion. What is collusion? So collusion occurs when 2 or more farms in an oligopoly industry meet secretly, and they sort of agree to control price, production, or other aspects of the market. Okay. And if they are colluding, right, so that the idea, the collusion, right, explicit collusion is illegal in the US, so they have to do this sort of secretly. So on the surface, like legally they're gonna be independent, and they're gonna act as if they are autonomous, means that they're sort of self-ruling, right? But on the inside they're gonna act as if they are a monopoly. Okay, they act as if they are one farm. Okay, and by acting like a monopoly, they can get a lot of benefit, because remember that the monopoly charges what, higher price or lower price?
Monopoly charges.
Then compared to like perfect competition, do they charge a higher price or lower price?
They charge lower.
No, actually,
But
if you are a monopoly, right, you have a lot of price setting power, right? You're a price maker, so they charge a higher price, but they produce a lower quantity. So by acting like a monopoly, they can do this, right? They can charge a higher price like a monopoly does, and they can produce a lower quantity, and then they can attain a profit like a monopoly does. And this is really inefficient because monopoly is producing lower than the socially optimal quantity, and they charge a higher price. So it's great for them, but it's not really good for the overall society. Okay, so then it's they're inefficient if they work like a monopoly. So that's why they don't do it very explicitly out in the open. um, so sometimes if sometimes if oligopoly farms are colluding, they will do like something, they will form something called a cartel. Okay, and a cartel are a group of farms, it can also be countries that create a formal agreement not to compete with each other. Okay, and so I just mentioned that the collusion is illegal. You can be sentenced for it. So but then there are sometimes in some cases, some collusive agreements, they're not so secret. The most well-known example of this comes from the OPEC countries. Do you guys know what the OPEC stands for? What OPEC stands for? It's OPEC.
What?
OPEC. Does anybody know what this stands for?
No.
Okay. So OPEC it's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Okay, the shorthand for this is OPEC. So they're a group of 15 countries in the world, such as Iran, Iraq, Libya, Angola, Venezuela, maybe Saudi Arabia as well, and maybe the UAE, countries in the Middle East, countries in Africa that are rich in oil, right? So these 15 countries, right, they formally sort of agreed not to compete with each other, in terms of because they're all oil producing countries, and they all export oil to other countries. So they have formed this thing called a cartel, and together these countries, they own 81% of the world's oil reserves. So that's a huge number of oil that they own altogether, and then they account for 44% of the world's oil production. Right, so they have quite a bit of market power. So what they do is they meet together, and they're gonna be like, oh, we're not gonna compete with each other. They all have a production limit. So they're all going to and they all sort of have an agreement on how much each country can produce, and price agreements in terms of what price they can charge. Right, so by doing this, they can sort of act like a monopoly. Okay, but there are certain issues with collusive behavior as well. So sometimes as you can imagine, it's very difficult to reach this mutually agreeable, right, um, t- like output, right? Because you're basically telling each other that you're going to have to restrict output, and you're only going to produce this much. So they're essentially trying to restrict supply. Sometimes it can be hard, because countries are going to look out for their own interests. So it's hard, it's difficult to arrive at a mutually beneficial or acceptable agreement about output. Okay, there can also be cheating, right? Even though this is a formal agreement, sometimes countries might not abide by it, and they don't charge the price that they agreed on, or they don't produce the amount of output that they agreed on. So that those kind of things can happen as well. And then because entry to this kind of market, oligopolistic market, is not impossible. So if a new farm do decide to come in, there can be loss of monopoly power and monopoly profit. Okay. Any question?
No.
All right. So that was collusive behavior. And what do non-collusive behavior look like? So if you are not meeting, not sort of, you don't have an agreement with your competitor, right? So you are doing thing on your own. So you can do this, but here, this that idea of interdependence comes back, right? You kind of have to worry about what your competitor is doing. Okay. So let's say if we have two farms, farm A and farm B. So two things, right? For scenario one, farm A decides to raise its price. Okay, so they're going to increase the price for their product. And now farm B has two choices. They can either raise their price or they can maintain their, original price. So if farm A raise their prices, increase their price, but farm B, and then farm B decides to raise their price as well. So both raise price. So they're both gonna see or enjoy an increase in profit, right? Because both of them did it at the same time. So the price is higher, revenue is gonna go up, and they're both gonna see an increase in profit. But let's say when farm A decide to raise its price, right? They increase their price, but farm B decided, no, I'm not going to raise my price. I'm just going to keep it as it is. So because we know that, they have a downward sloping demand, even though we didn't show it here, they face a downward sloping demand curve. So if the price for if farm A is raising their price, they might see, there would be a lower quantity demanded for their product. And, now farm B has a lower price. So some customers from farm A is now going to go to farm B because, the product they're selling, is, it's not like their monopoly products, which is unique, right? That you can't find anywhere. So they're differentiated, which means that, they're probably close substitutes for each other, right? So then if farm B, lowered its price, it's going to see an increase in profit, but farm A lost out on its market share to farm B, right? So as you can see, right, farm A deciding to raise its price, it wasn't enough just to raise its price. It sort of has to contemplate and think about, what the other farm might do, right? Because, um, if they both do the same thing at the same time, they can see an increase in profit, right? In the case of raising price. And if, one farm raised its price and the other farm didn't, the price raising farm is going to see, right, a decrease in their profit. Okay, so that was scenario one. And then with scenario two, right, let's say farm A no longer wanted to increase their price, but now they're going to lower their price. Okay, so what can farm B do? They can lower their price as well, or they can maintain their price. If they decide to lower their price, if both farms are lowering their price, right, they're going to see less profit than before. But if farm A decided to lower its price and farm B maintained it, right, we're going to see the inverse scenario, right? Now farm B is going to lose their market share because they raised their price is now more expensive compared to farm A, and farm A is going to see an increase in profit. So as you can see, they're always going to have to look out and sort of watch what the competitor is doing, right? So what they usually do, this kind of oligopolies, they try to beat out competition. Usually, they're going to try to do it with something other than price, because with price, it's kind of difficult, right? Because if you do one thing, um, usually if somebody increase their prices, the competitor doesn't match. The competitor will only match if they lower their price. Okay, but if you both lower your price, you're both gonna earn less profit than before. So usually what happens, is they're gonna try to beat the competition through product differentiation. Maybe if we're talking about a shoe company, somebody comes out with a new shoe, right, that has really good insole, the competitor, you're gonna be sure that the competitor is gonna launch, a very similar product in a few days, right? And they're gonna try to do it through like a lot of advertising and spend a lot of money on advertising, bring out celebrities and whatnot. So usually non-collusive oligopolies, they'll try to compete with each other on like methods other than prices. Okay, so this is all we're going to talk about for today. Next week when you guys come back on Tuesday, we're going to talk about this thing called game theory, which is kind of the only difficult thing, or not difficult, but it's once you get the idea, it's not difficult. But that is the only sort of like time consuming things that we're going to talk about, and then hopefully we can finish oligopoly on Tuesday.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, I'll see you guys on Tuesday then.
Bye.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you.
Have a good weekend.